following is a presentation of the Reformation Bible Society. It is a recorded breakout session from the August 3rd, 2024 conference in Lynchburg, Virginia.
So our next paper is on Old Testament Bible translations and the Septuagint by Jonathan Arnold, who's pastor of Westminster Baptist Church in London. You might wonder why a Baptist church has the name Westminster as its title, but it's because it's in Westminster. Jonathan is the General Secretary of the Trinitarian Bible Society, and before that he was the Editorial Director and in charge of Bible translation projects. And so I'll pass on to Jonathan to speak to us on the subject of Old Testament Bible translations in the Septuagint.
Thank you very much, Matthew. May I begin by just reading two verses from Scripture from the Gospel according to Matthew and chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, where we read, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." End quote. This has long been regarded as a verse of Scripture that is referring to the Hebrew. And for the Old Testament Hebrew is something that we find reinforced in the Reformation period. We find the purpose of Hebrew Scriptures being the standard that should be used throughout the Reformation period. And we had some very interesting insight into some of the debates that were going on around that time as well from Dr. Cranendonk. I hope in this paper just to spend a little time looking at some of the standards that were applied during the Reformation period, and briefly at the preface to the translators, to the reader, to the authorized version. I hope to look then at some of the confessions. What does the confession say with regard to the Old Testament? And then turn a little bit to Switzerland and to have a look at some controversy around the Old Testament there and a particular matter dealing with it. Following that, I hope to then look at what we have today. What does modern day translations that we find say they are translating the Old Testament from? And I hope to draw out that there has been a shift, and there is a shift, no doubt due to the material that we find on the Septuagint, of beginning to include readings from the Septuagint and adjusting the Masoretic text to comply with the Septuagint. And we've heard some examples of those today as well. In terms of the King James Version, in 1611, they openly point out that they consult translations, let me just quote, translations or commentaries of the Hebrews, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, the Latins. Neither did we think much to consult the translators or commentators, Chaldean, Hebrew, Syrian, Greek, or Latin, no, nor the Spanish, French, Italian, or Dutch, and so on. So they consulted this, and no doubt, you know, in my work as Trinitarian Bible Society, when translators can understand another language of an already existing translation, to be able to see how that has been translated from Greek or Hebrew into English or something else can be a great help to them. And in that sense, I am sure the Septuagint is a help in that regard. But I would, of course, argue it is not a corrective to the Masoretic text. They continue to go on to say this: "In this confidence and with this devotion did they," and they're talking about they in terms of the translators, "assemble together not too many, lest one should trouble another, and yet many, lest many things haply might escape them. If you ask them what they had before them, truly it was the Hebrew text of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. These are the two golden pipes, or rather conduits, wherethrough the olive branches empty themselves into the gold." And so they point us clearly to their use of the Old Testament Hebrew, consulting or using the Septuagint in the translational aspects. And we'll see a little later now, in many modern versions, that's changed to corrective. We also find this position in the confessions. Many of you know the statement well. In the Westminster Confession, the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of writing was most generally known to the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages, are therefore authentical, so as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal unto them. So we have that standard in confession, that it is the Old Testament Hebrew. Then I'd like to mention something called the Helvetic Consensus. The Helvetic Consensus was a reformed confession, you might term it that way, from 1675. And it was written in the midst of a controversy with regard to the Old Testament with a man called Capellus, a debate over the vow pointing, and also to deal with some doctrinal matters with regard to the fall of man. And the Helvetic Consensus points us clearly to the Old Testament and to the Hebrew text. Let me just quote a translation of that consensus from translated in 1990. We read, "Therefore, we are not able to approve of the opinion of those who believe that the text of the Hebrew original exhibits was determined by man's will alone, and do not hesitate at all," this is the opponents of the Helvetic Consensus framers, "and do not hesitate at all to remodel a Hebrew reading which they consider unsuitable and amend it from the versions of the Septuagint and other Greek versions, the Samaritan Pentateuch, or by the Chaldaic Targums, or even from other sources. They go even to the point of following the corrections that their own rational powers dictate from the various readings of the Hebrew original itself, which they maintain has been corrupted in various ways. And finally, they affirm that beside the Hebrew edition of the present time, there are in the versions of the ancient interpreters, which differ from our Hebrew text, other Hebrew originals, since these versions are also indicative of ancient Hebrew originals differing from each other. They thus bring the foundation of our faith and its sacred authority into perilous danger." End quote. And you see, way back 1675, these arguments, and they're seeking to stand even then against some who will maybe seek to edit the Masoretic text. In fact, as some of you may know, the well-known historian and also writer Richard Muller, in his post-Reformation dogmatics, the rise and development of Reformed orthodoxy, he says this regarding the Helvetic Consensus. The Helvetic Consensus stands firmly within the Reformed tradition's commitment to the original text of Scripture as the ultimate authority. While it does not explicitly address the Septuagint, its insistence on the primacy of the Hebrew and Greek text implicitly critiques any translation, including the Septuagint, that might be used to challenge or override the original languages. And there in Richard Muller's assessment, their position was clear. There shouldn't be an overriding of the original languages by the Septuagint. We heard mention of Emmanuel Tov, what you might call in many ways the father of Old Testament textual criticism, and he would be opposed to certain positions on the Masoretic text, but he even says this, let me just quote him. "Although many important studies have been written on the Septuagint translation in general as well as its individual books, we possess no firm knowledge about the circumstances surrounding these translations. In short, we do not know much about the translators and their enterprise, nor even the sequence in which the books were translated." And so even there you see Tov indicating his skepticism and his caution with regard to the Septuagint. Moving on then from some of that Reformation foundation, if I might describe it that way, to where we are today. We find that there is an increased amount of material, and we find there are some very interesting and helpful comment in books that have been published recently with regard to the Septuagint. But many of them have had influence, and some have influenced Bible translations towards amending the Masoretic text according to the Septuagint. However, there's only one Bible I'm aware of, correct me if I'm wrong, that in an English translation that follows the Septuagint text, whole Bible, and that's the Orthodox Study Bible. Let me then turn to modern translations. We found earlier Dr. Fuller referred to the New Revised Standard Version and its use of the Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia from 1977 and amended in 1983. And there it has some differences in terms of how it's set out, but in that particular translation we find many references to the Septuagint. In the NIV, the translator's preface with regard to the Old Testament says this. This is the 1978 edition. For the Old Testament, the standard Hebrew text, the Masoretic text as published in the latest edition of the Biblia Hebraica, has been used throughout. The Masoretic text tradition contains marginal notes that offer variant readings and have sometimes been followed instead of the text itself. Because such instances involve variants within the Masoretic tradition, they have not been indicated in the textual notes. In a few cases, words in the basic consonantal text have been divided differently than the Masoretic text. Such cases are usually indicated by textual footnotes. And then if we move down, it speaks of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they've been looked at. It then says readings from these versions, speaking of the Septuagint, the Aquila, Symaicus and Theodotion, and the Latin Vulgate. It says readings from these versions, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the scribal traditions were occasionally followed, where the Masoretic text seemed doubtful, and where accepted principles of textual criticism showed that one or more of these textual witnesses appeared to provide the correct reading. In rare cases, the committee has amended the Hebrew text where it appears to have become corrupted at an earlier stage of its transmission. So, consulting some of these other textual witnesses and even maybe making an executive decision, you might say, in certain places. New King James Version refers to using, again, the Stuttgart edition of the Hebrew text from 1967 to 1977, and also consulting the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. ESV says this, a slightly shorter statement. It says, to this end, each word and phrase in the ESV seeks to be weighed, and it's again based on the Biblica Hebraica from 1997. It also indicates that in difficult cases, and that's the term that's used, in exceptional, difficult cases, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Syriac Peshitta, the Latin Vulgate, and other sources were consulted to shed light on the text, or if necessary, to support divergence from the Masoretic text. The NASB from 1997 again points to the fact that the translation team, while working directly from the best available Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text, has taken into account important variants, including those in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, where these provide significant clarity or meaning to the text. And lastly, the Christian Standard Bible, again, mainly basing it on the Biblia Hebraica, and then also referencing the fact that it uses the best available Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts. The preface to the CSB says, the CSB translators employed the Septuagint in instances where it provides valuable insight or where the Hebrew text is ambiguous, aiming to present and present a clear and precise translation. These excerpts that I've given from various different prefaces maybe indicate the influence to which the Septuagint has had and continues to have on some of the well-known translations that we would be aware of. In fact, you find there are different assessments. The CSB talks about the aim to give valuable insight. The ESV talks of where there's difficult circumstances. Well, thankfully, some people have done some work as to how much the Septuagint has been used. Clenenden and Stabnow, in their article Navigating Horizons in Bible Translations, they sought to represent the times translations had departed from the Masoretic tradition and follow ancient versions or amend the text by conjecture. I'm going to concentrate just on the Septuagint amendments. And as Dr. Fuller points out at the end of his article on Dr. Owen, the numbers that are presented in some of these statements are likely to be underestimates of the total number. So let's then turn to these different versions and where the Septuagint is used. According to Clenenden and Stabnow, for the ESV, and where it's cited, it's referring to the footnotes, I believe, and where I speak of preferred, it's talking about in the actual text. So the ESV, it's believed, cites the Septuagint 326 times, and it prefers the Septuagint 277 times. The Holman Christian Standard Bible cites the Septuagint 761 times and prefers the Septuagint 257 times. The New American Standard Bible cites the Septuagint 68 times and prefers the Septuagint 53 times. The NIV Septuagint is cited 317 times, and it's preferred 226. New Living Translation, just to throw a different one in there, cited 340 times the Septuagint, preferred 240. And you see in that a slight picture. There are some that the Christian Standard Bible, for example, has a heavy preference towards citing the Septuagint in the footnotes. The ESV is more of a mixed picture, and the NIV as well. Surprisingly, maybe to some, the ESV cites the Septuagint, according to these scholars here, more than the NIV does. And maybe that's the influence of the Revised Standard Version, from which that translation had some drawings. What about then the New King James? Well, the New King James does have some influence of the Septuagint. It is using a slightly different Hebrew text than the Authorized Version. The King James Version, as you would say this side of the pond, the King James Version is based on Benjamin's edition and published by Daniel Bomberg in Venice and from 1524 to 1525, whereas there's a slightly later edition of the Ben Asher text that is used for the New King James. In the Old Testament, there is reference in Genesis 4, verse 8, in Deuteronomy 3:28, Job 22:25, and Isaiah 63 in the margin. However, there are also inclusions in the actual text of the influence of the Septuagint. For example, the first book of Chronicles, chapter 6, verse 28, Vashni, the surname of Samuel's firstborn son, is changed to Joel after the Septuagint, Syriac, and Arabic. Likewise, Psalm 4, verse 4, stand in awe and sin not, is changed to be angry and do not sin. And this appears to follow the influence of the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. Also in Obadiah, where we read the day that he became a stranger is rendered the day of his captivity. Again, maybe slightly more the influence there of the Latin Vulgate. So I hope that gives just a picture, and my intention really was to show you In terms of Old Testament translations, what are we looking at today? What is the sort of impact of the Septuagint? And I hope you've seen that in that regard. The Helvetic consensus, which I quoted, and the Reformed tradition, I would suggest, emphasizes the primacy of the Masoretic text and the Greek received text. The confessional emphasis on original Hebrew, being providentially preserved and kept pure in all ages, is an encouragement to us to continue looking to that, maybe rather than seeking the vlogger of a translation. And whilst historically significant and translationally helpful, the Septuagint should not be used to change the Masoretic text. I know diverse approaches to this exist in modern translations, but it is a worrying thing when we hear of translators making textual decisions when that is certainly not their area of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this presentation from the Reformation Bible Society. To learn more about our society or to apply for membership, please visit our website, reformationbiblesociety.org.